I've always been a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. But there were things I couldn't explain. And one in particular kept coming back to me, like an unsolved mystery from my past. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. It was the kind of place where news spread faster than wildfire, and any deviation from the norm was fodder for gossip and speculation. But what happened that fall surpassed all previous stories. Back then, I was just a typical high schooler, more concerned with video games and hanging out with friends than anything serious. But an incident during a hiking trip forever changed my perception of reality. My friend John and I were supposed to go on that hike, but we both came down with the flu the day before. The doctor said we were in for a week of bed rest. Honestly, I wasn't too upset about it. Staying home, playing video games, and watching TV seemed far better than lugging backpacks through the woods. On Monday morning, the group, including our geography teacher, Mr. Hammond, and 14 other classmates, set off on the hike. They planned to trek through the old forest west of town, rumored to contain ancient abandoned mines and scenic views of the valley. They were expected back by Thursday. When Thursday came, they didn't return. Parents started calling each other, asking if the kids had ended up at someone's house. By that evening, the school organized a meeting and announced that a search would begin. The next morning, police and local volunteers joined the search. I remember my mom flipping through local news channels, trying to get updates on the search. The radio gave hourly updates, but there was little information. School was canceled, and students and teachers scoured the nearby woods. By Sunday afternoon, when hope was starting to fade, the group returned. They emerged from the edge of the woods and slowly made their way back to town. None of them ran to their parents or waved their arms in joy. They all looked exhausted, dirty, and distant. The next day at school, the atmosphere was tense. The students who had been on the hike stuck together, separate from everyone else. During breaks, they silently walked the halls, talking to no one. Mr. Hammond had changed too. He used to joke and tell stories, but now he just sat at his desk, not looking up. They all seemed like different people. Cold, lifeless shells instead of the lively individuals they once were. "Have you noticed how weird they're acting?" I asked John during lunch. "Yeah, it's creepy," he replied, his eyes fixed on their table. "It's like they saw something, or something happened to them." "Maybe we should go check it out this weekend," I suggested, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. John nodded. We decided we needed to find out the truth, whatever it was. On Saturday morning, John rode his bike to my house. He lied to his parents about staying over at my place, and I told mine I'd be at John's. After what had happened, they wouldn't have let us go into the woods under any circumstances. We packed our backpacks with water, flashlights, and some food. I tucked a knife into my pocket just in case. We didn't have the exact route the students took, but we knew the general direction. "Are you sure you want to do this?" John asked as we stopped at the edge of the woods. "Absolutely," I replied, though my voice betrayed some hesitation. We entered the forest. The crunch of autumn leaves underfoot and the sounds of nature created a sense of solitude. We hiked for several hours, following old forest trails and occasionally veering off to explore interesting spots. "It looks like we're not going to find anything," John said, looking around. "Do you feel like we're just wasting our time?" "Let's wait a bit longer. We're already here," I insisted, though I was starting to doubt our venture. A few hours later, as we discussed heading back, I smelled something faint and unpleasant. It was a mix of mustiness and decay. "Do you smell that?" I asked, stopping. "What?" John paused, sniffing the air. "That smell, it's weird," I said, looking toward where the odor seemed to be coming from. We followed the scent, which grew stronger and more foul. We both pulled our scarves over our faces to try to block it out. "Are you sure we should keep going?" John shook his head, his eyes showing worry. "Just a bit further. We need to see where this smell is coming from," I continued. and John followed. We walked for another 20 minutes until the stench became unbearable, and John began to vomit. I approached a small hill and suddenly saw a small cave. The smell was coming from there. "John, are you okay?" I called back to him. "Just go on, I'll catch up," he replied, wiping his mouth. I nodded and headed towards the cave entrance. Inside, it was dark and damp. I turned on my flashlight and slowly walked deeper. The light fell on something that at first seemed like a pile of branches and leaves, but as I got closer, I realized they were bodies. "Oh my God," I whispered, stepping back. The bodies were mutilated, their clothes torn, eyes gouged out, arms and legs broken and twisted in unnatural ways. Some faces were flayed. I rushed out of the cave, gasping for air from the horror and the stink. "We need to get out of here. Now," I said, grabbing John's hand. We ran through the woods, not looking back until we reached a familiar path. I stopped to catch my breath and looked at John. There were bodies. Our classmates. "And Mr. Hammond," I gasped, trying to make sense of what we had seen. John stared at me, his eyes filled with horror and confusion. "What do we do now?" His voice trembled. "We need to tell someone. We have to go back to town and call the police." I looked at him, feeling a mix of nausea and primal fear. When we got back to town, it was already dark. We went straight to my house where I told my dad everything. His first reaction was angry. He was more concerned about why I had lied about staying at John's and had gone wandering in the woods. "Are you sure you saw what you're talking about? Could it just be old sacks or something?" His mood shifted, and his voice sounded anxious. "No, Dad, they were bodies. I'm sure." I tried to stay calm, but my hand trembled as I drank some water. Dad looked at me, then at John, and nodded. "Okay, I'll call the sheriff. He'll figure it out." The sheriff arrived within half an hour. John and I told him everything from start to finish, not missing any details about the smell, the cave, and the bodies. He listened silently, nodding and taking notes. "We'll head there right now," he said, standing up. "You'll show me the place." We went with the sheriff, his deputy, my dad, and another police officer back into the woods. The journey there felt like an eternity. It was very dark in the woods, and our flashlights barely lit the path ahead. When we reached the cave just before dawn, the sheriff went in first. After about 5 minutes, he came out shaking his head. "There's nothing there," he said. "What do you mean, nothing?" "There were bodies," I protested, anger mixing with fear. "Son," I checked myself, "it's empty. Maybe you got confused, or it was just your imagination." His voice was confident and irritated. We returned home in complete silence. Dad was clearly angry and disappointed. "You shouldn't have made up such nonsense and made fools of us," he said as we walked into the house. That night was sleepless. I tossed and turned, trying to understand what had happened. The bodies couldn't just disappear. John and I couldn't have been so mistaken. The next day at school, rumors had already spread. Some saw us as heroes, others as jokers or liars. But one thing was common. No one believed what had really happened. The following night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard a noise outside. I went to the window and saw a figure on the pathway leading to our house. It was Mr. Hammond, or someone who looked like him. He stood there, staring straight at me, smiling a creepy, predatory smile. When our eyes met, he slowly brought a finger to his lips, signaling silence. I jumped back from the window, my heart pounding wildly. Who or what it was, I didn't know. But one thing was clear. Something had happened in that forest, and it was more significant than just a hike. My last year in school passed in a haze. We both saw how strangely those who had returned from the hike behaved. They spoke little, avoided old friends, and their gazes were often empty and detached. But no one else seemed particularly concerned. Apparently, everyone had gotten used to their new quirks, or they simply chose to ignore anything unusual. Rumors about the strangeness of these students still crawled through the town, but over time they became more blurred and indistinct. People said they saw them walking in the woods at night or whispering about something incomprehensible, but it all remained at the level of conjecture and unconfirmed stories. After high school, I went to college in another city. It felt like I turned a new page in my life, one not overshadowed by those events. At university, I threw myself into my studies, trying to distance myself from the past. John stayed back in our hometown and we gradually lost touch, each of us found our own way to cope with the past. Now, years later, I still don't know what it was. Government experiments? Aliens? Something supernatural? The answer remains a mystery, but I know the bodies of our classmates and Mr. Hammond were in that cave, and what I saw makes me question everything I ever believed.